On New Year's Eve, Rachel receives an unexpected invitation to an exclusive party at the Rosewood Tower, an opulent building known for its mysterious history. As she enters the grand celebration, she feels an unsettling tension in the air, like something is hiding just beneath the surface. When a woman mysteriously vanishes and Rachel uncovers a hidden chamber, she begins to unravel a terrifying truth: the Rosewood Tower is no ordinary venue, and every year, its guests become part of a dark, unbreakable ritual. Trapped in a cycle she can't escape, Rachel must uncover the secrets of the building before she, too, disappears forever. Rachel had always been a curious person, but that didn't mean she was reckless. As a young journalist, she had learned to trust her instincts, which often helped her navigate the murky waters of city life. But when the envelope arrived, sealed with an elegant gold emblem, she felt a mix of excitement and wariness. The invitation was unlike anything she'd ever received: no return address, no sender's name, just an ornate script with the words "Join us for an unforgettable New Year's Eve at the Rosewood Tower," followed by the time and location. There was no mention of who the host was or why she had been invited. Yet, there was something oddly compelling about it. The Rosewood Tower was an exclusive building in the heart of the city. Known for its opulence and its rumored connection to the city's most influential people, it was the kind of place where only the wealthiest and most powerful mingled. Rachel didn't consider herself to be part of that world. She had a modest apartment in a more affordable neighborhood and a steady job at a local news outlet. But the invitation lingered in her mind for days, its mystery gnawing at her. Was it some sort of publicity stunt, a social experiment, or something else entirely? After much deliberation, Rachel decided to attend. Her editor had always pushed her to get more involved in the city's high society, believing it would open doors to bigger stories. This was an opportunity she couldn't pass up, even if it felt odd. If nothing else, she could report on the strange event, giving her the perfect angle for an article. The night of the party, Rachel stood before the towering glass entrance of the Rosewood Tower, her reflection staring back at her. The lights from within spilled onto the sidewalk, casting an inviting glow, but a sense of unease settled over her. She was wearing her best dress, something she hoped would help her blend in, but she felt painfully aware of the fact that everyone around her seemed to belong to another world entirely. Expensive suits, sparkling jewelry, and the hum of quiet conversations filled the air. She entered the building, her heels clicking sharply on the polished marble floor. The lobby was massive, with towering ceilings and intricate chandeliers casting soft, golden light on the crowd. The guests were dressed to perfection, their laughter and chatter creating a buzzing energy that seemed to pulse through the space. No one appeared to notice her arrival, and Rachel couldn't help but feel like an outsider. At the reception desk, a woman in a sleek black dress handed her a glass of champagne without a word. The glass felt strangely heavy in her hand, as if it wasn't just filled with alcohol, but with something more, an unspoken promise, perhaps. Rachel took a sip, scanning the room for anything or anyone that might explain what was really going on here. There were dozens of people, all with their faces slightly obscured by the ambient light, their conversations hushed and filled with meaning. Despite the lavish surroundings, something about the atmosphere felt off. Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right, though she couldn't put her finger on it. The host was nowhere to be seen. In fact, no one seemed to know who the host was. As the night wore on, Rachel mingled with a few guests, all of whom seemed polite but distant. No one really gave her their full attention. She overheard bits and pieces of fragmented conversations, each one more cryptic than the last. One woman spoke about the long wait, while another mentioned how this year would be different. Rachel caught snatches of names she didn't recognize and faces that seemed to hold a hidden meaning. The building, despite its splendor, felt strangely cold. The massive windows revealed a city skyline that looked alien from this height. the lights of the streets below blurring into a sea of colors. As she stood at the edge of the room, trying to make sense of it all, she overheard a conversation that piqued her interest. Two men were speaking in low voices, one of them mentioning something about a tragic event and the anniversary. The words hung in the air, and Rachel's instincts kicked in. What tragic event? What anniversary? Suddenly, the clock on the wall chimed, signaling that there were only minutes left until midnight. The crowd shifted, moving toward the center of the room, as if drawn by some invisible force. Rachel was swept along with them, but she couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. The entire evening had been strange, and now, as the countdown began, she had the distinct feeling that something was about to unfold, something that would change everything. The lights dimmed as the final seconds ticked away, the tension in the air rising like a palpable force. The sound of glasses clinking and murmurs of excitement filled the space as everyone prepared for the clock to strike midnight. Rachel stood at the back of the room, trying to make sense of what she had experienced so far. But the more she thought about it, the more confused she became. And then as the clock struck 12, something shifted. The buzz of excitement suddenly stopped, the air growing unnervingly still. For a moment, everything seemed frozen in time. Rachel, standing at the edge of the crowd, felt her heart race. Something was wrong, she could feel it in her bones. She glanced around, searching for any sign of what was happening. The guests continued to smile and clap, but their expressions were unnervingly blank, as though they were all part of a scripted performance. And then she noticed something that sent a chill down her spine. One of the women who had been standing near her had disappeared. At first, Rachel thought she might have simply moved to another part of the room, but as she scanned the area, the woman was nowhere to be found. She turned back toward the crowd, but no one seemed to notice that someone had vanished. It was as if the woman had never existed at all. The more Rachel thought about it, the more unsettling it became. The party continued, the guests laughing and mingling as if nothing had happened. But for Rachel, the atmosphere had shifted from uneasy to downright eerie. She couldn't explain it, but she knew something was terribly wrong. There was a sense of dread hanging over the building, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just witnessed the first hint of something much darker than she could have imagined. With every passing minute, Rachel's unease grew. She couldn't explain why she felt so uncomfortable, but she knew she had to find out more. What had happened to the woman, and who exactly was behind this mysterious party? As Rachel continued to scan the room for any sign of the missing woman, a sense of dread began to tighten around her chest. The festivities were carrying on as if nothing had happened. The guests, with their polished smiles and well-practiced laughter, seemed to be in their own little world, completely oblivious to the strange occurrence. Rachel's eyes darted around, but there was no sign of the woman who had vanished, no trace, no disturbance in the crowd. At first, she thought maybe it was just a misunderstanding, that the woman had simply stepped away. But as time passed, her anxiety deepened. The building, despite its grandness, seemed to hold its breath, and Rachel felt trapped in its walls. Every passing minute felt heavier than the last. She excused herself from the group she had been standing with, trying to blend in with the crowd as she made her way toward the back of the room. She wandered through a few empty hallways in the back of the building, hoping to find someone who might have seen something. The silence was deafening, save for the faint hum of distant music still emanating from the main event space. The contrast between the chaotic celebration upstairs and the eerie quietness of the building's lower levels felt off. It was as if two different worlds were colliding in one place. Rachel found herself standing in front of a door that seemed to lead to a more secluded section of the building, an area that appeared unused, untouched. It was a stark contrast to the luxury of the rooms upstairs. The hallway felt colder here, darker, almost oppressive. She hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open. The room was dimly lit, with old furniture covered in sheets and dust collecting in every corner. It looked like no one had entered this part of the building for years. Her heart began to race as she ventured further into the room. It didn't feel like part of the same building she had entered hours ago. This place was abandoned, forgotten. But what struck her most were the photographs scattered across the floor. Old black and white pictures that seemed to capture moments in time. People smiled in the frames, but there was something unsettling about their eyes, something that didn't sit right with her. As Rachel knelt to examine one of the photographs, she froze. One of the faces in the photo was unmistakable, the woman who had disappeared. Her image was frozen in time, her face staring back at Rachel from the dusty surface of the old photograph. She could feel a cold shiver run down her spine. This was no coincidence. A rustling noise broke her concentration, and she quickly stood up, her pulse quickening. Her mind raced. Had someone been following her? Was this part of a bigger scheme? A sinking feeling gripped her stomach as she realized that she might not be alone. She quickly turned, but there was no one there. Still, the unease didn't leave her. The air felt heavier, thicker now, as if the very walls were closing in around her. She took a deep breath and tried to steady herself. The building was full of secrets, and she had just uncovered one more. The woman's disappearance wasn't just an accident, it was connected to something far darker. Rachel didn't know what she had stumbled into, but she was determined to find out. The clock was ticking, and she was starting to understand that whatever was going on in the Rosewood Tower wasn't just a strange party. It was something far more dangerous. Rachel's discovery of the photograph had unsettled her, but it also lit a spark of determination. The woman who had disappeared, the one who had smiled in that black and white picture, wasn't the first person to vanish from the Rosewood Tower. Something much darker was at play here. Her mind raced as she retraced her steps, moving back through the building's labyrinthine corridors. The guests continued to celebrate upstairs, unaware of the ominous feeling that had begun to settle within her. She needed answers, and she was getting closer. As she turned a corner, she came across an old man sitting in a small, forgotten sitting room. His hair was thin and white, his face lined with age, and his eyes carried a heaviness that made Rachel pause. The man didn't appear to belong to the current gathering, yet there he was, almost blending into the shadows. He wasn't part of the celebration, in fact. He looked completely out of place. Rachel approached him cautiously, and after a moment, the man looked up at her with tired eyes. "I see you've found it," he said, as though he had been expecting her. Rachel was taken aback by his words. How could he know what she was looking for? The man's gaze was sharp despite his frailty, and he spoke again, his voice low and gravelly. "The Rosewood Tower has a way of drawing people in," he murmured, "but not everyone leaves." The warning in his tone sent a chill down her spine. Rachel leaned in closer, her curiosity overtaking her fear. "Who are you?" she asked. The man took a long, drawn-out breath, his eyes clouding as though he were recalling something from the depths of his memory. "I used to live here," he began, "many years ago, before they started the traditions." He paused, his eyes flicking nervously toward the hallway as if expecting someone to hear him. "The host, you see, is not just someone from the outside. No, they've been part of this building for a long time, perhaps longer than anyone knows. The people who disappear, well, they don't really disappear. They're part of the cycle." He fell silent, the weight of his words sinking into the room. Rachel's heart beat faster, trying to absorb the gravity of what he was saying. "Cycle?" she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "Every New Year's Eve it's the same." "A ritual," he explained, his voice growing quieter, almost conspiratorial. "People think it's a celebration, but it's something far worse. The host chooses someone with a past they've tried to escape. The building, it knows your secrets. And the cycle starts again." Rachel's mind raced. She had heard whispers of tragic events connected to the Rosewood Tower, but never anything so chilling. The disappearance of the woman was part of a ritual, an unending cycle that spanned generations. And the woman, Rachel realized, had probably been chosen long before she arrived. She, too, could be a target. The sense of danger now felt more immediate, more pressing. The man didn't offer more information, his eyes growing distant again. Rachel didn't press him further. She knew there was no time to waste. She needed to find the host, to understand the twisted game that was playing out before her eyes. But she also knew one thing for certain: whatever was happening, it was much bigger than any New Year's Eve party. The party had shifted in tone. What had initially seemed like a luxurious gathering had now become a suffocating trap. The guests, despite their polished appearances, were beginning to act strangely. Their laughter had grown hollow, their eyes distant. It was as if they were part of some dark, collective ritual they couldn't escape, and Rachel could feel the tension building in the air. She needed to get to the bottom of this. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, Rachel's sense of urgency grew. The man's words echoed in her mind. The host chooses someone. It was clear that the woman who had vanished wasn't the first, and she might not be the last. Rachel couldn't afford to wait any longer. She began to search the building again, moving through the empty hallways, pushing open doors that led to rooms she hadn't seen before. The building felt alive in a way that unnerved her, shifting, changing, as if it was aware of her presence. She had to find the host, confront them, and understand what this cycle really meant. As she wandered deeper into the building, Rachel found herself drawn toward a large, ornate door at the end of a dimly lit corridor. The door was different from all the others she had encountered. It wasn't locked, and it opened with a creak as she pushed against it. Inside was a small, circular room, sparsely decorated but filled with strange, cryptic symbols carved into the walls. The floor was covered in dust, but there were traces of something recent, footprints leading to a hidden trapdoor at the center of the room. Without thinking, Rachel opened the trapdoor, her pulse quickening. The stairs that descended were narrow and winding, leading her down into the unknown. She couldn't turn back now. The air grew colder as she descended, and the silence became oppressive, broken only by the sound of her footsteps. At the bottom, she found herself in a hidden chamber, a space that felt as ancient as the building itself. And there, in the center of the room, stood a figure. The host, but not in the form she had expected. The figure was masked, their identity hidden, their voice distorted as they spoke. They welcomed Rachel by name, as if they had been anticipating her arrival. "You've come to understand the cycle," the host said, their voice echoing in the chamber. "But there are things you can never unlearn once you know. You've seen it now, what happens here every year." Rachel stood frozen, unable to comprehend what was happening. The host had been controlling everything from the shadows, orchestrating the disappearance of the guests as part of a twisted game. The ritual wasn't just about punishment, it was about something far more insidious. The building itself was part of it, a vessel for a dark power that ensnared those who entered. The host began to speak in riddles, describing how the building itself had a life of its own, its purpose tied to the very essence of time and memory. Those who entered the Rosewood Tower were fated to play their parts, whether they realized it or not. The New Year's Eve celebration was just the beginning, a ritual that repeated itself in an endless loop, trapping souls within the walls. And Rachel, it seemed, was the next chosen. The realization hit Rachel like a punch to the gut. She had become part of this cycle, just like everyone else who had ever stepped foot inside the Rosewood Tower. The host was right. Once you learned the truth, there was no turning back. The game had already begun, and she was caught in its grip. The room around her seemed to warp and shift, the walls closing in as the host's voice echoed in her mind. "You can never leave," the voice intoned. "Not really." Rachel's heart raced as she looked around, her breath coming in short gasps. The building was alive, every hallway, every room, a part of the trap that had ensnared her. She could feel the pulse of something ancient, something dark, thrumming beneath the floorboards. Desperately, Rachel turned to run, but the trapdoor slammed shut, sealing her inside the chamber. The host's laughter filled the space, cold and mocking. She stumbled back, her mind reeling. She had been foolish to think she could escape. Foolish to think she could understand the full scope of what she had walked into. In the distance, she could hear the sounds of the party above the music, the laughter, the cheers. But it all felt so distant now, as though it belonged to a world that no longer existed. The building was shifting, its walls pulsing with an energy that threatened to consume her. Suddenly the lights flickered, and Rachel found herself back in the main hall, as if nothing had changed. The guests continued to celebrate, their faces blank and unaware of the terror that had unfolded beneath their feet. The clock struck midnight again. Time was repeating itself. The cycle was starting over, and Rachel was trapped, just like everyone else who had ever entered the Rosewood Tower. There was no escape. The party would go on forever, and she would be a part of it, destined to relive that night for eternity. The screen faded to black, leaving only one haunting question. Was this truly the end, or was it just the beginning again?